wrestle Shane Douglas for $1 million. Who is he? I mean, let's get serious. Who is Shane Douglas?
He was weak. Those 3 words from Ric Flair carried more weight than any insult ever could in professional wrestling. When the Nature Boy called someone weak, he was not talking about muscle or size. He was not commenting on how much weight they could lift in the gym. He was talking about something far more brutal and far more specific. He meant they could not do the job. They could not work. They could not be trusted inside the squared circle. They could not uphold the standards that defined professional wrestling during its greatest era. Flair spent decades as the traveling NWA World Heavyweight Champion. That title was not just a prop you carried over your shoulder for photographs. It was not ceremonial. It was a responsibility that demanded excellence every single night. He had to fly into different territories every week, different cities, different states, different countries. He had to wrestle local stars of all different skill levels. Some were fantastic workers. Some were green rookies. Some were washed-up veterans hanging on for one more payday. Flair had to carry all of them to matches that looked real, that looked competitive. That kept fans believing wrestling was a true athletic contest. The illusion had to be maintained at all costs. Flair learned his craft in the AWA training camps under Verna Gone. This was no ordinary wrestling school. Gone was a former amateur wrestling champion who believed in legitimate athletic ability combined with showmanship. Flair trained alongside the Iron Sheik and Ken Patera. These were technical masters who could hurt you if they wanted to. This environment shaped everything Flair believed about the business. So he absorbed a philosophy that would guide his entire career. Fundamentals mattered above everything else. Psychology mattered. The ability to read a crowd and adjust in real time mattered. The capacity to call a match on the fly, making it up as you went based on audience reaction, separated the greats from the pretenders. When Flair labeled someone as weak, he was using a very specific standard, a standard built on decades of carrying the business on his back, a standard forged in the fire of defending that NWA title night after night in front of hostile crowds who wanted to see the local hero win. If you are enjoying this deep dive into Flair's brutal honesty and want to support this video, give hype to it right now and help us share this story with more wrestling fans who need to understand what real excellence looked like. Right now, Flair always said he could wrestle a broomstick to a 5-star match. That was not arrogance talking. That was not an old man bragging about the glory days. That was his literal job description as NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He made everyone look good. It did not matter if you were a technical wizard or a clumsy giant. It did not matter if you had been wrestling for 20 years or 20 days. Flair would structure the match to hide your weaknesses and highlight your strengths. He would make the crowd believe you had a chance to beat him, and then he would beat you in a way that made you look strong in defeat, but not everyone could meet him halfway. Some wrestlers were unsafe in the ring, dropping their opponents on their heads or throwing wild punches that connected for real. Some were completely untrained. He thrust into the spotlight before they understood basic mechanics. Some relied on gimmicks to hide their lack of basics, needing costumes and characters to distract from their inability to work. Some needed weapons and blood because they could not throw a proper punch or execute a simple arm drag. Flair noticed all of it. He kept mental notes. He remembered who made his job harder and who made it easier. Over the years, through countless interviews, podcast appearances, and his autobiography, To Be the Man, Flair revealed his list. The wrestlers he considered the weakest, not the smallest in stature, not the least popular with fans, the ones who failed to uphold the standards of the craft, the ones who exposed the business or put people in danger or simply could not perform the basic functions of the job. And this is the story of those 10 wrestlers, grouped by the type of weakness they represented and why Flair's judgment still stings decades later. Flair believed in a simple but profound rule that governed his entire approach to professional wrestling. Wrestling should look real without being truly dangerous. It required cooperation between 2 trained athletes who trusted each other. It required skill developed over years of practice and repetition. It required an understanding of psychology, timing, and how to manipulate a crowd's emotions. The hardcore movement of the 1990s violated all of that. Wrestlers started relying on weapons to get reactions, thumbtacks scattered across the ring, ladders used as launching pads, tables set on fire for dramatic effect, blood flowing freely from intentionally opened cuts, with extreme bumps that left permanent damage on bodies. Flair saw this as a shortcut, a way to get a cheap reaction without earning it through fundamentals. To Flair, if you needed a staple gun to get the crowd invested, you were weak. You were hiding your inability to work a traditional wrestling match. You did not understand how to build drama through simple holds and escapes. You could not tell a story with your body language and facial expressions. Two names stood out as the worst offenders in this category of weakness disguised as toughness. Number 10, Mick Foley. Flair called Foley a glorified stuntman in his autobiography. Those words became legendary in wrestling circles. They sparked debates that continue today. Flair admitted Foley was a great attraction who drew money and captivated audiences. Fans loved Mick Foley. They connected with his underdog persona in willingness to sacrifice his body. But Flair did not think Foley was a great worker by the standards that mattered. He believed Foley lacked fundamental soundness in the ring. According to Flair, Foley could not execute basic strikes properly. His punches looked weak. His kicks lacked impact. He could not tell a compelling story without props to carry the narrative. Without ladders to climb or barbed wire to fall into or a flaming table to crash through, Foley struggled to hold attention. Flair came from the territorial system where wrestling was treated as a simulated struggle. You protected your opponent above all else. You worked snug to make it look real, but you avoided actual injury wherever possible. The goal was to have a great match and then do it again tomorrow night in the next town. Foley did the opposite. He took insane risks that shortened his career and damaged his body permanently. He threw himself off the Hell in a Cell cage. He landed face first on thousands of thumbtacks. He lost an ear in a match in Germany. To Flair, that was not strength or toughness. That was weakness. It showed Foley did not trust his own ability to connect with a crowd through pure wrestling ability. He needed the spectacle to compensate for technical deficiencies. Flair also criticized Foley for what he perceived as sucking up to writers and bookers backstage. He believed Foley used backstage politics to secure his spot in the company because his ring work could not do it alone. Foley was friends with Jim Ross and had connections with Vince McMahon. Flair saw this as another form of weakness. She was relying on relationships rather than performance. Foley's supporters, and there are many, argued his psychology was absolutely brilliant, that his ability to make fans genuinely care about his matches and his character was unmatched, that he understood storytelling better than almost anyone in the business. But Flair judged by a different ruler. He judged by the standards of the NWA champion who had to work a clean technical match against a scientific wrestler one night and then brawl with a hardcore guy the next night and make both matches look equally legitimate. And by that ruler, by that specific measurement of professional wrestling excellence, Foley was weak. He was a stuntman in wrestling gear, not a true craftsman of the art form Flair dedicated his life to perfecting. Number 9, the Sandman. If Mick Foley was a mainstream star who used hardcore elements to enhance his character and connect with audiences, the Sandman represented the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Flair explicitly stated that the Sandman was no wrestler at all. He was a niche performer who could do absolutely nothing in a traditional ring environment. He belonged in the hardcore realm of ECW, where the rules were different and the standards were lower. Industry observers and wrestling journalists agreed with Flair's assessment. A match involving the Sandman in 1997 received a rating of negative 3.5 stars from the Wrestling Observer newsletter. Negative, not 0, not 1 star. Negative stars meaning the match actively detracted from the show and made the audience's experience worse. The report mentioned blown spots where moves were mistimed or executed incorrectly. It mentioned clumsy wrestling where the Sandman stumbled through basic sequences. He missed his cues. He could not remember his positioning. His strikes looked terrible. The Sandman could not execute the basics that trainee wrestlers learn in their first month. He stumbled through sequences that should have been simple. He missed obvious cues from his opponents. His entire act relied on drinking beer during his entrance, smashing the cans against his head, and hitting people with a Singapore cane. Strip away those props and there was nothing left. No athletic ability, no psychology, no understanding of how to work a crowd without weapons. Flair viewed the Sandman as a symbol of everything wrong with the hardcore era. Mindless stunts replacing dignified craftsmanship, violence substituting for skill, spectacle overwhelming substance. To Flair, calling the Sandman weak was not even an insult designed to hurt feelings. It was just an objective fact, a professional assessment of someone who had no business being in a wrestling ring. The 1980s and 1990s saw professional wrestling shift dramatically towards spectacle and visual impact. Promoters wanted massive bodies that looked impressive on television and on promotional posters, huge muscles that seemed superhuman, intimidating physiques that made casual fans stop and stare. Skill became secondary to appearance. Technical ability took a back seat to marketability. Flair hated this trend with every fiber of his being. He had worked with giants before during his NWA days. Some were great workers who understood their limitations and worked within them. Some were absolute disasters who exposed the business and endangered their opponents. The worst were the ones who looked like champions, who had the physical appearance promoters dreamed of, but who could not move properly, could not react to their opponent's offense, could not be carried to even a decent match match by a master worker like Flair. 3 names define this particular category of failure. Number 8, the Ultimate Warrior. Flair has repeatedly called the Ultimate Warrior his all-time worst opponent. Let that sink in for a moment. Ric Flair worked hundreds of matches over a career spanning 5 decades. He wrestled in tiny armories and giant stadiums. He faced technical wrestlers, brawlers, high flyers, giants, and everything in between. And out of all those opponents, stretching across 50 years of professional wrestling, the Ultimate Warrior stands alone as the absolute worst. That is a stunning claim that reveals just how bad the experience must have been. Flair gave very specific reasons for this harsh judgment. The Warrior insisted on scripting every single match in advance down to the smallest detail. He wanted to know exactly what would happen and when. He refused to call anything on the fly or adjust based on crowd reaction. Flair absolutely despised this approach. Wrestling to him was about reading the crowd and responding to their energy. If a certain move got a huge reaction, you did more of that. If the crowd was not responding to something, you cut it and tried something else. You made music with your opponent, one improvising like jazz musicians who knew the basic structure but created magic in the moments. The Warrior did not care about any of that. He wanted everything planned, everything rigid, everything controlled. There was no room for creativity or spontaneity. On top of that fundamental philosophical difference, the Warrior was genuinely unsafe to work with in the ring. Flair said Warrior dropped him directly on his head during their matches. The Warrior's work was absolutely brutal and terrible. He had no timing sense, no instinct for when to speed up or slow down, no understanding of cooperation between opponents. He treated matches like solo performances where the other person was just a prop. Flair refused to drop the WWE Championship to the Warrior despite enormous pressure from the office to do so. Instead, he chose to lose the title to Bret Hart, a technician, a craftsman, someone who valued the same things Flair valued and who could be trusted to protect his opponent and protect the business. That decision spoke volumes about Flair's priorities. Popularity with fans did not matter to him when evaluating talent. Box office appeal did not matter. What mattered was competence. What mattered was being able to work safely and tell a compelling story. And the Ultimate Warrior had absolutely none of those qualities despite being one of the biggest stars the business ever produced. Number 7, Brackus. Brackus represented everything wrong with the body era distilled into one person. He was an awesome physical spectacle who turned heads the moment he walked into a room. Huge muscles that looked carved from stone and incredible strength that allowed him to perform impressive feats. He looked like the prototype for what a wrestling champion should be in the minds of promoters who valued appearance over ability. But despite that incredible look, Brackus was utterly forgettable as a performer. WWE management recognized he was extremely green and lacking in basic wrestling instincts. They tried to help him develop by farming him out to smaller independent companies in Europe. The hope was he would gain valuable experience working in front of different crowds, learn from different opponents, and come back to WWE as a polished performer ready for the big time. He did eventually come back, but he was only marginally better than when he left. His instincts never properly developed. He could not read situations, and he could not adjust his performance based on what was happening match. His failure in the Brawl for All tournament exposed just how limited he was. That tournament was supposed to be a legitimate tough man competition with real punches and real fights. Brackus failed miserably, showing he lacked even practical combat awareness despite his impressive physique. To Flair, Brackus was definitive proof the industry had completely lost its way. Promoters prioritized the look of a champion over the ability to actually function as a champion. Brackus had the look that sold tickets and moved merchandise, but he did not have the mind, the instinct, or the skill to back it up. He was all sizzle with no steak. Number 6, Giant Gonzalez. Giant Gonzalez, who performed as El Gigante during his time in WCW, was 7 feet tall and an absolute spectacle to behold. Fans stared in amazement when he walked to the ring. Children pointed and gasped. Casual observers could not believe someone that large existed, but he could not wrestle to save his life. He transitioned to wrestling from basketball, and the adjustment never happened. He had no coordination in the ring, no ability to react to basic wrestling maneuvers, no sense of timing or positioning. Arn Anderson, one of Flair's closest friends and a member of the legendary Four Horsemen, famously said that God put that big fella on earth to do something important, but wrestling definitely was not it. Flair personally tried to work with Gonzalez and carry him to acceptable matches. He tried every trick he had learned over decades of making lesser opponents look competent. But even Flair, acknowledged as perhaps the greatest worker in wrestling history, could not hide Gonzalez's severe limitations. The Giant could not bend his body properly, could not sell moves convincingly, could not execute even the simplest offensive maneuvers. He was a spectacle that belonged in a circus sideshow, not in a professional wrestling ring where cooperation and skill mattered. Flair's Flair's frustration with Giant Gonzalez highlighted a key truth about the business. Big bodies can still be fundamentally weak if they cannot safely and competently do the basic job that wrestling requires. For Ric Flair, professional wrestling was built on a foundation of respect. Respect for the business itself and its proud history. Respect for the champions who came before and established the traditions. Respect for the systematic way things were done in the territories. Some wrestlers, in Flair's experienced eyes, completely lack that essential respect. They let their egos control their decisions and poison their relationships. They played backstage politics to advance themselves at others' expense. They accused Flair of holding them back and sabotaging their careers when the reality was they simply were not ready for the responsibility they demanded. Two names stand out prominently in this category of political and egotistical weakness. Number 5, Scott Steiner. The rivalry between Ric Flair and Scott Steiner became the stuff of wrestling legend, remembered for its intensity and genuine animosity. It started back in 1991 during a match at Clash of the Champions 14. Flair defended the NWA World Heavyweight Championship against Steiner in what should have been a straightforward title defense. After the match concluded, Steiner publicly accused Flair of purposefully delivering a weak and lazy performance designed to make Steiner look bad in front of the crowd. Steiner believed Flair deliberately made the match slow and plodding when it should have been an exciting athletic showcase. He said Flair stalled excessively, killing the crowd's enthusiasm and preventing Steiner from showing what he could really do. From Flair's completely different perspective, this so-called stalling was not sabotage at all. It was professional defense. Flair reportedly bristled at the idea of dropping the world title to Scott Steiner at that point in time. He did not believe Steiner was ready for the enormous responsibility that came with being the traveling world champion. The stalling was a defensive professional maneuver, a way to protect both the match and the business from what Flair saw as a mistake. This led to lasting bitterness between the two men. Years later, Steiner delivered a shoot promo where he attacked Flair verbally to his face on live television. He called Flair a weak old man, desperately clinging to power and refusing to let younger talent rise. Flair saw Steiner as a disrespectful young wrestler who fundamentally did not understand or appreciate the traditions of the business. Both men genuinely believed the other one was weak, but only one of them had carried the NWA Championship for years. Only one had proven beyond any doubt he could make absolutely anyone look good. That was Ric Flair. Number 4, Shane Douglas. Shane Douglas spent decades taking verbal shots at Ric Flair whenever a microphone was placed in front of him. He repeatedly called Flair old and washed up. He called him a bad worker who could not go anymore. He claimed Flair's reputation was built on politics rather than talent. The conflict originated when a young Shane Douglas approached Flair seeking professional advice and mentorship. Douglas felt completely blown off and dismissed. He felt Flair ignored him and treated him like he was not worth the time. Douglas carried that deep resentment for years, letting it fuel his later criticisms. Flair, on the other hand, largely ignored Douglas throughout most of his career. He viewed Douglas as a joke. He did not take him seriously as a threat or as a legitimate main event talent. When they finally had a brief feud in WCW during the year 2000, Flair made his true feelings absolutely clear through his actions. He refused to wear proper wrestling gear for their matches. He worked the bouts in street clothes like he had just wandered in from the parking lot. He looked visibly bored and annoyed throughout. He was signaling to the live crowd and the television audience that Shane Douglas was not an opponent worthy of his full professional effort. This was psychological warfare at its finest. Flair devalued Douglas as a main event performer simply by treating him like he fundamentally did not matter. To Flair, Douglas was weak because he never truly earned his spot in the business. He complained constantly. When he whined about not getting opportunities, but he never proved himself capable in the ring where it actually mattered. Sometimes weakness in professional wrestling is not about a lack of effort or dedication. It is about being thrust into a position you are simply not ready to handle. Flair witnessed this happen to young wrestlers who were pushed far too soon, often because of family connections to people in power or because of catastrophically bad management decisions. Two particularly tragic examples stand out in Flair's memory. Number 3, David Flair. Ric Flair's own son David was pushed into professional wrestling by WCW bookers and management, specifically by Vince Russo, who became infamous for his crash television style of booking. Flair has been brutally and painfully honest about his son's wrestling career in ways most fathers would never be. He openly stated that David was far too nice to be a professional wrestler. He lacked the necessary aggressive temperament the business demanded. More importantly and more dangerously, David was not properly trained when he was thrust into major physical angles on national television. He was vulnerable. He was inexperienced. He did not know how to protect himself or work safely. Flair was especially critical of how Hulk Hogan treated David during their storyline together. Hogan whipped David with a heavy leather weight belt over a dozen times during an angle. The punishment was excruciatingly painful and left serious injuries. None of it was discussed or agreed upon beforehand. Hogan just did it because the cameras were rolling and it would create a dramatic moment. Flair saw this as a complete failure of management to protect a young performer. They essentially sacrificed David to the audience before he could properly develop into a viable professional worker. David's weakness was absolutely not his fault. It was the system and the people in charge who failed him catastrophically. But the end result was exactly the same. He could not safely do the job that professional wrestling required. Number 2, Mike Von Erich. Mike Von Erich came from one of the most famous and respected families in professional wrestling history. The Von Erich name was legendary in Texas and throughout the territory system. His brothers Kerry and Kevin were two of the absolute best talents in the entire business. Incredibly athletic, naturally charismatic, beloved by fans. But Mike was fundamentally different from his brothers. Flair candidly noted that Mike frankly was not meant to be a professional wrestler. It simply was not his calling. He tried as hard as any human being could try. He gave absolutely everything he had to live up to the family name, but he never became even a passable mid-card talent despite years of effort. The enormous pressure of the Von Erich legacy was simply too much for him to bear. He was pushed into the wrestling business out of family obligation and the expectations that came with his last name, not because of natural aptitude or genuine desire. Flair's philosophy about weakness suggests this represents a unique and tragic kind of failure. Not laziness or unprofessionalism, not ego or attitude problems. Just a fundamental mismatch between the person and the profession they found themselves in. Mike's story ultimately ended in personal tragedy that devastated the entire Von Erich family. Flair saw it as definitive proof that the wrestling business could absolutely destroy people who were forced into it against their natural abilities and inclinations. Even among wrestlers whose primary job was losing matches to make stars look good, there were professional standards that had to be maintained. Enhancement talent, often called jobbers, were supposed to make the stars look devastating and unstoppable, but they still needed to be fundamentally safe workers. They needed to be professional in their approach. They needed to be reliable and consistent. Some wrestlers failed even at that basic level, and some simply were never sharp enough or dedicated enough to rise above their designated status, no matter how much time passed. The enhancement talent tier includes several names that Flair and his peers in the business openly criticized. Jim Powers was part of the Young Stallions tag team during the 1980s. The team occasionally picked up wins to maintain some credibility, but they mostly existed to make established teams look dominant. Paul Roma, his tag team partner, eventually moved up the card and joined the Four Horsemen stable, a move that Flair himself later criticized as a mistake. But Jim Powers was consistently viewed as the weak link of the team who was holding Roma back. Roma himself later called Powers lazy in interviews. He cited substance abuse as a major ongoing problem that prevented Powers from reaching his potential. Powers definitely had the muscle-bound look that WWE absolutely loved during that era, but he severely lacked the work ethic and natural potential that Flair demanded from anyone he shared a ring with. Then there was Buff Bagwell, whose real name was Marcus. Bagwell played an arrogant jerk character quite effectively and had decent charisma, but critics consistently noted he was never particularly sharp when it came to actual in-ring work. Watching him defeat legitimate world-class talents like Kurt Hennig, better known as Mr. Perfect, was genuinely embarrassing for the industry. It exposed how low the standards had fallen. Bagwell relied almost entirely on character work and his physical appearance. He used those things to mask a serious lack of in-ring sharpness and technical ability. Flair recognized this as a common and growing problem in WCW during the late 1990s. Style was prioritized over substance. Gimmicks and characters mattered more than fundamental wrestling ability. Number 1, the Spirit Squad. In the mid-2000s, WWE introduced the Spirit Squad to their programming. This was a stable of male cheerleaders who were presented as a comedy act. Ric Flair viewed them as the complete antithesis of everything professional wrestling should represent. They embodied everything he hated about the direction the business had taken. He and Roddy Piper, another old-school legend, participated in several matches that were specifically designed to systematically dismantle and humiliate the squad. And they treated the group as an absolute joke, both in storyline and behind the scenes. At Survivor Series in 2006, Flair personally eliminated 3 different members of the Spirit Squad entirely by himself. This was not merely a storyline decision made by writers. It directly reflected Flair's genuine view of their abilities. He thought they were a goofy stable that actively devalued the product and made wrestling look silly. Even when Flair eventually lost a singles match to Spirit Squad member Kenny in 2007, it did absolutely nothing to elevate the young performer or give him credibility. Flair had already firmly established them as jokes in the eyes of the fans. The damage was permanent and irreversible. The Spirit Squad represented everything Flair genuinely hated about modern wrestling. They were gimmick-heavy sports entertainment with absolutely no respect for the craft. They were were cartoon characters in a business that Flair believed should be treated with dignity and seriousness. Not all of Flair's harshest criticisms were reserved for lesser-known wrestlers or obvious failures. Even established legends and Hall of Famers faced his uncompromising judgment. Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan are undisputed icons of the industry, main eventers who drew massive money and headlined the biggest shows. But Flair still found significant fault with both of them because his standard was incredibly specific and uncompromising. His standard was the NWA style of wrestling, improvisational rather than scripted, technical rather than character-based, safe but realistic looking, and by that particular standard, by that specific measurement, on even the acknowledged greats had weaknesses that Flair was willing to point out. Bret Hart and Ric Flair had an extremely complicated professional relationship over the decades. They respected each other's abilities and accomplishments, but they also clashed repeatedly over philosophy and approach. Hart absolutely hated Flair's trademark chops to the chest. He thought they were completely pointless and unnecessarily stiff. He felt they hurt for no good reason and added nothing to the match. Hart also criticized Flair's signature routines and sequences. The Flair flip into the corner, the figure 4 leg lock. Hart called these spots ridiculously phony and endlessly repetitive. He felt they exposed the predetermined nature of wrestling. Flair, in turn, believed Hart was far too rigid in his approach to matches. Hart insisted on pre-planning every single match down to the smallest detail. He wanted everything carefully structured and scripted in advance. Flair genuinely thought this approach prevented Hart from being a truly great worker in the improvisational sense that Flair valued above everything else. Flair claimed Hart believed his own press clippings too much, that he became inflexible and unable to adapt. Flair also noted that The Undertaker similarly disliked his chops to the chest. The Undertaker would explicitly limit Flair to only 3 chops during their matches together. But Flair viewed that as simply a personal preference and mutual professional respect, not as any kind of lack of skill on Undertaker's part. With Bret Hart, the situation felt different to Flair. He saw it as a fundamental philosophical divide about what wrestling should be. Hulk Hogan was without question the single biggest star professional wrestling ever produced. His popularity transcended the business and made him a mainstream celebrity. But Flair absolutely did not think Hogan was a great worker by any meaningful standard. Bret Hart once analyzed both Flair and Hogan as having seriously limited ability in the ring when compared to true innovators like Randy Savage or even Mick Foley. Flair's specific critique of Hogan centered primarily on artistic control. Hogan ruthlessly controlled every aspect of his matches. He protected his image and his character above all else. And Flair believed Hogan fundamentally did not care about hurting younger talent if it served his purposes. And the incident with David Flair proved that beyond any doubt. Hogan whipped a completely untrained young man with a leather belt. He never discussed it beforehand or got consent. To Flair, a performer who relies primarily on a silly, repetitive routine and natural magnetism to distract audiences from seriously limited technical skill, is fundamentally weaker than a true craftsman who can work any style. Hogan was undeniably a massive star who changed the business, but he was absolutely not a worker, not by Flair's exacting standard. As Ric Flair aged and his body inevitably began to fail him, his own physical limitations started to inform his perspective on what truly constitutes weakness in professional wrestling. His final official match in 2022 became a fascinating case study in what happens when physical strength completely fades, but psychological strength and ring intelligence remain intact. Flair revealed in interviews that he actually passed out twice during that final match due to severe dehydration. He had become dangerously obsessed with reaching what he considered his perfect weight, 219 pounds exactly. He stopped properly hydrating his body in the days leading up to the match. During the actual match itself, he became seriously lightheaded and struggled to continue. He physically could not keep up with the pace his younger opponents wanted to maintain. So he did something remarkably clever that showcased his decades of experience. He performed a fake heart attack spot in the middle of the ring. He had previously done this exact same spot in WCW during a storyline involving Eric Bischoff. It was a calculated tactic designed to dramatically slow the match down, to give everyone involved a chance to breathe and recover, to regain control of the situation. Booker T publicly criticized the spot afterward. He said using a fake heart attack was in genuinely bad taste. Flair strongly defended the decision. He explained it was absolutely necessary under the circumstances. He needed to force everyone to slow down before someone got seriously hurt. This moment revealed Flair's final and most important message about weakness and strength. Even when the physical body becomes weak through age or injury or illness, the psychological mind can still effectively run the match. Psychology matters more than muscles. Improvisation matters more than athleticism. Ring generalship matters more than physical conditioning. Flair's infamous list of the weakest wrestlers is not simply a collection of cruel insults designed to hurt feelings or settle old scores. It represents a complete philosophy about about professional wrestling, a standard of excellence, a benchmark against which all performers should be measured. To Flair, the truly weakest wrestlers are those who cannot cooperate with their opponents, who cannot execute the basic fundamentals that form the foundation of the craft, who cannot work safely and protect the people they share the ring with, who rely on shortcuts and gimmicks rather than developing real ability. Foley hid behind hardcore violence and weapons. Warrior absolutely refused to call anything on the fly. May Brockus had the impressive look but completely lacked the mind and instinct. Gonzalez could not move his giant body properly. Steiner and Douglas let ego and politics control them. David Flair and Mike Von Erich were pushed into the business before they were ready. The Spirit Squad were presented as a complete joke. Even legendary names like Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan had serious flaws when measured by Flair's specific ruler. But Flair's harsh critiques were never just about tearing people down or making himself look better by comparison. They were fundamentally about defining excellence in professional wrestling. Flair carried the NWA World Heavyweight Championship through different territories for years. He wrestled local stars of absolutely every skill level imaginable. He made all of them look good regardless of their limitations. That was his professional job and sacred responsibility. And he took it more seriously than almost anything else in his life. When he called someone weak, he was not being needlessly cruel. He was being completely honest based on his standards. He was protecting the business he loved. The Nature Boy standard was built entirely on fundamentals, on psychology, on the ability to create magic inside the ring with absolutely any opponent, even a broomstick. Today, wrestling fans still passionately debate Flair's list and his judgments. Some people defend Foley's brilliant psychology. Some argue Warrior was massively over with fans despite his flaws. Some think Flair was too harsh on his own son or on Shane Douglas. But absolutely no one can deny the lasting impact. Flair's harsh words fundamentally shaped how we judge greatness in wrestling. See, his standard became the standard that matters. When we ask if a wrestler is truly great, we unconsciously ask Flair's questions. Can they actually work? Can they call it on the fly? Can they stay safe? Can they carry a weaker opponent? These questions define the craft at its highest level. Ric Flair's legacy is not just his countless classic matches. It is his uncompromising philosophy, his absolute refusal to accept mediocrity, his demand that wrestlers earn their spot through genuine skill, not through shortcuts or politics or gimmicks. The 10 weakest wrestlers on his brutal list serve as cautionary tales for future generations. They remind us what happens when spectacle completely overshadows craftsmanship, when gimmicks replace fundamentals, when ego replaces respect for the business. Flair's list is undeniably brutal and unforgiving, but it is also a love letter to the business he dedicated his entire life to perfecting. A business that should demand excellence, a business that must punish weakness, and a business that, in Flair's eyes, should always be about one thing above all else: making it look real, making it matter, making it worthy of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship that he carried with such pride. The Nature Boy standard lives on today, and those he called weak will never escape that permanent label. Because when Ric Flair said you were weak, he absolutely meant it, and he was usually right.